Well, the Supercommittee's Wednesday deadline is fast approaching. Earlier, I caught up with Republican Senator Mike Lee from Utah to talk about some ambitious recommendations for the committee and the Supreme Court's decision this week to take up the legal fight over the president's health care law. Senator Lee, thank you very much for making time for us today. One of the things, of course, just all over Washington that we're waiting for is to find out what happens with the Supercommittee, if they can reach a deal before Thanksgiving. I know that you're going to be meeting with a Tea Party group that says they can save $9.7 trillion and do it without raising taxes. What are your hopes that something like that could actually be accomplished?
Well, I think we have to get to that point if we're ever going to balance our budget, and that's why I'm glad that Freedom Works and some of these other groups have come forward to give us some proposals, to give us some advice on how we might do that.
Do you have hopes that the committee will actually get something done by the Wednesday deadline?
You know, I have hopes that they'll do it. I have hopes that we can find anything that will allow us to make the cuts that we need to make. I have been a pessimist about the Supercommittee from its inception, largely because I think it's not really a recipe for success anytime you try to consolidate the power of 535 members of Congress into a 12-person committee and have them meet behind closed doors. I think there are risks built into that. That said, if they can come up with cuts, I'm happy to examine them.
If they don't, and we hit sequestration, there's been some talk about possibly Congress trying to revamp that, go around it, to remove the trigger. What do you think happens next if we get to Wednesday without a solution?
It's really difficult to predict, in part because if they come up with a partial solution, that could partially offset what their obligation is. And so until we see that, it's hard to say what the next step is. There is also the option of passing a balanced budget amendment, which would satisfy the obligation for this next tranche of debt limit authority. And the House is voting on that today. I think the Senate will be voting on it within a few weeks.
I have seen bipartisan support for that idea. I mean, it's not something that's solely coming from Republicans. What do you think about the prospect of getting Democratic votes on a balanced budget amendment?
I think it's strong. I feel so strongly about this. I've written a book about it, The Freedom Agenda. And as I explained in the book, this is something that Democrats and Republicans support, even liberals and conservatives support. In fact, 75% of all Americans think we need to do this. We need to restrict, on a constitutional basis, Congress's authority to borrow, because it's been abused.
All right, I want to ask you, this week we heard that the Supreme Court is officially going to take up some of the legal challenges to the president's health care law. You believe that Congress went way beyond their powers as enumerated in the Commerce Clause. Of course, those who support this law say that's not so. Do you think the justices ultimately, at least 5 of them, will fall to your way of thinking?
I certainly think they should, and my hunch, although it's difficult and dangerous to predict what the Supreme Court might do, I think they will, because I think they have to. Let's think about the fact, the possibility that they might hold that it's valid, that it's constitutional. There really is no limit on Congress's power at that point. There's no reason why Congress at that point couldn't say, if we can tell you that you have to buy a specific kind of health insurance, we can also tell you how many servings of green leafy vegetables to eat every day. This cuts right to the heart of what our country was built upon. We have to remember, Shannon, that our country became a country. We revolted against our mother country, Great Britain, not just because we wanted to get rid of a king, of the monarchy, but because we had grown accustomed to local self-rule. We were not well suited as Americans, and still are not, to a large, distant, sovereign national government, because that tends to result in tyranny, whether the government in question is headed by a king on the one hand or by an elected president on the other hand.
And quickly, I want to ask you, they're doing something that, as far as we can tell in modern history, is unprecedented, giving 5.5 hours to oral arguments for a number of different issues stemming from the health care law. A lot of calls coming from Capitol Hill and other groups to have it televised. Never happened before. Where would you fall on that issue?
You know, I defer to the justices on that. They'll have to make their decision on whatever basis they think is sound. I do think it's interesting that this is a 5.5 hour oral argument. The fact that they're willing to do that, this is very unprecedented. When I worked at the court, I never saw one go much over an hour. 5.5 hours truly is unprecedented. Perhaps that suggests they might be willing to open the court to cameras in this instance. They'll make that decision, I'm sure.
It would be a first. Senator Lee, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. All right, we taped that interview minutes before Senator Lee was set to launch a meeting of the Tea Party Debt Commission just steps away in that same Senate building. However, Lee says the Senate Rules Committee, which is controlled by Democrats, kicked out the hundreds who had shown up because the meeting has been touted as a hearing. That would have broken Senate rules. Here's some video of how it all played out.
It's not simulating a hearing. A hearing is an official function in which you're conducting a legislative investigation. I've convened a panel of experts. We're going to have a panel discussion. And with all due respect, I think that's for me to decide whether this is a hearing and not for you. What we haven't discussed is sufficiently important that we need to not have any threat of interference by any Senate staff member. I will.
All right. right. Lee led the group off Senate property to hold the meeting at a nearby private building. Still a dispute about whether or not that was considered a hearing.